All right, welcome everybody. Welcome back. We are finally back in the Americas. We've left the chaos and warfare in the Three Kingdoms and the English Civil War. And now I want to talk today about how those conflicts map onto changes in the settlement of the colonies in this period. And for those of you that are on Twitch, the number, as you can see, is 379-436. And I will occasionally, I try to remember to bounce back to this. Occasionally, I can see your questions for folks on Twitch on my tablet here that I'm holding in my hand. And okay, so to start with, from the perspective of Great Britain, we talked about this before, the less valuable places that are suited for dissenters are the places in what we would call the North, New England, and the upper part of the Mid-Atlantic. And the more desirable places, attractive to investors and cronies of the English crown, are in the lower period. Now, there is this period in which the Cromwell and the Parliament control Great Britain from, 1642 to 1660, so it's a relatively short period of time, about 18 years. And in that period, things are more chaotic, but certainly, to say the least. And so there are some people coming over, but the settlement of the South that happens before the 1640s is really just in Virginia, primarily. After the English Civil War, there's a much more serious settlement in what we call South Carolina and Georgia, but which they thus called, what we call North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, but which they called Carolinas. 1649, Charles I was executed, and the sort of a somewhat personal story about that. My family, my John Nelson, my seventh great grandfather, was captain of the guard for Cromwell's army, and may have been the person. Captain of the guard for Cromwell, actually, in London and Westminster, and may have been the person who cut off Charles I's head. We don't know who cut off his head. The person wore a fishnet, multiple fishnets over their face, and a fake beard. And the 49 people who were involved in the execution of Charles I were chased down by agents of the European state and even people in Virginia. But my ancestor managed to escape by rushing off to what was then New Amsterdam and taking a Dutch name. No one knows where the head of Charles I is. In fact, there's a whole bunch of places in and around London that are called King's Head Tavern that were supposedly founded shortly after Charles I was executed, with the King's Head underneath at the corner. Charles II comes back in 1660 with the help of the Cavaliers, with the help of about 8 to 10 landholding gentry who stood by him through the Revolution, through the English Civil War, and those people he rewarded handsomely. Charles II may have actually seen his father's execution, and as a monarch was kind of a mess, obsessed with sex. He had all these mistresses. He gave most of the members of the court syphilis. Yeah, that's directly or indirectly. In reward for their support, he establishes Carolina, named after his father, Charles, the Latin being Carolus. And so he names this whole region after the region that we're in, actually, Carolina. And after 1660, we see the sort of, I would say, the Restoration 1%, the people who supported the Restoration, 8 large landholders, courtiers, as well as some French Protestants who allied with Charles I, even as they opposed the French king. And it's after 1660 or so that we start to see the orphanages and prisons of England emptied, and those people are sent to the New World as indentured servants. This is the Carolina Charter. Talked about before the Treaty of Tordesillas and this sort of massive, expansive, impossible claims. And so you see here the Carolina Charter. It goes to 8 landed proprietors, repayment for their support in his exile. And what we now call Georgia, indeed Southern California, and most of Texas, and North Florida, all the way down to the 29th parallel, he gives, quote unquote, to these folks. Georgia is only going to be settled later. Most of the settlement ends up in Charleston, Charlestown, again, named after his father. I'm sick of talking about kings. I want to talk a little bit about what kind of Southern society looked like. And Southern society with, as you can imagine, lots of former prisoners and orphans and somewhat brutal and violent plantation owners bent on growing initially tobacco, but also a lot of what's now South Carolina and Georgia was a place where cattle were, and both beef and pork, both cows and pigs, for basically feeding the colonies that are in the Caribbean. And this social order was mostly men and incredibly violent. Yes? People online say that the torch says offline. Oh, thank you. I'm still offline on Twitch? Okay. Shoot. All right, I'm going to stop streaming and start streaming. Okay. I hope this works. I'm not seeing an error for the display. All right. Actually, could some... Oh, there I am. Okay. I see myself on Twitch. I think the Southern Social Order. They say you're good. I'm good? Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. All right. So the Southern Social Order then is very high death rates, relatively few women, very low birth rates. The death rates were high in the South because of the warm weather and swampy soil. The swampy soil had mosquitoes, which carried malaria and helped to transmit dysentery. If we were to break up the colonies of what becomes the United States, we need to talk about 4 regions. One is the Chesapeake. That's the area around Virginia. That was before the English Civil War initially, and then settled afterwards. And the Chesapeake is basically Anglican. And the Anglican Church basically runs Virginia. The churches provide the roads. Tobacco is what funds the colony. That's the Chesapeake. That's Virginia, Maryland, and the northern part of North Carolina. There's the lower South, which is where we are, South Carolina, what becomes North Carolina and Georgia. Then New England, which is, I'll talk about in a few minutes, which includes Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, but also Nova Scotia, now in Canada. And then there are the middle colonies, which are more complicated, and they're sort of a mix of northern and southern colonies. And finally, the most important, as I suggested, is the Caribbean. Okay, so this, the joint stock companies that establish themselves in Virginia and in the Carolinas are all about returns from gold and other minerals, and hope to produce crops that are otherwise not produced in England. So that's wine, citrus fruits, olive oil. Why would that be? Why would those places be, why would it be important for the crown to get these goods from elsewhere, either in person or on? I'm going to show the people who are on OBS, the Slido again, 379-436, and then go back. Okay, good. Imported exotic goods were a sign of wealth. To give them an advantage in trading. What were the four regions again? Chesapeake, the lower South, New England, and the middle colonies, they were called. Middle colonies are like Delaware and Maryland. Okay, good. The crucial thing is that olive oil and citrus fruits and those sorts of goods are coming from Spain and France and Italy, and Britain doesn't want to have to pay for those things out of its own wealth, out of its own trade. So it's attractive for Great Britain to get these goods from the New World where they may come cheaper. None of this really works. The citrus, they're even trying to produce silk in South Carolina. None of that works. I'll talk about what did work ultimately when we get to the 1700s. No one imagined that tobacco would build Virginia, but it's tobacco, finally, that does. It's a Caribbean strain of tobacco that is, it's not the kind of native Virginia strain, but it's a Caribbean strain of tobacco, which is sweeter, which then sweeps across Virginia and becomes a cash crop that draws people to the region. That said, the Virginia company skirted bankruptcy again and again, even after tobacco, and they institute a royally sanctioned lottery, and that fails. They create a system of what are called particular plantations with special grants of land to large landowners. King Charles finally called it quits in 1623. And Charles declares it a royal colony in 1625. Settlers in the South then are nobles and adventurers who are given large tracts of land. So these wealthy folks who are connected to Charles II pass on land to second sons. The first sons inherit the land in England. The second sons or third sons are given land in the New World, which is in turn given to them by the king. Remembering that Europe is still largely a feudal society, these men are associated with people around the crown. As a result, for example, land in Virginia was often parceled out to gangs of men who were close to the governor, and the governor were literally the king's representatives. All right. So death rates were very high: malaria, dysentery, also yellow fever. There were other diseases that flourished in the south and not much in the north, and those are smallpox, diphtheria, and other generic vices. In fact, initially when people wanted to settle in the New World in Virginia, they wanted to settle near what becomes Richmond, pretty far up the river in Virginia. And every time the royal ships came in, they would say, no, this is too far up. You need to settle further in a place like Williamsburg or Jamestown. But people would die there just from all of these diseases and things like that that were endemic in the South. You could argue that this Southern distinctiveness even continues to today. This is the murder rate in the 2018 census, and as you can see, it's double in the South what it is in the Northeast per 100,000 people each year. And that the sort of some of the distinctive characters of that southern settlement with these wealthy planters and adventurers and things like that helps explain in part what becomes a very distinctive society in the South, the American South. There is a tiny number of gentry families with names that come to be called the first families of Virginia. There are a few very important families in Georgia whose descendants are extremely powerful politically. There are a number of white indentured servants, and those people, those indentured servants, basically rose up and with disturbing regularity, so that a particularly brutal plantation owner with black and white workers would very often be killed by his own workers in places around Virginia. Bacon's Rebellion is really the peak of that conflict in Virginia. Bacon's Rebellion, Nathaniel Bacon basically wants more land for him and other former indentured servants in the West. He himself is not an indentured servant, but he represents 200 or 300 indentured servants. And together they demand that Virginia kill more Indians in the West, taking more land. Governor Berkeley basically blocks him. And so Bacon and his men march on Jamestown, take over Jamestown, and run it for a couple of months, leaving Berkeley and his men basically quaking in fear. Berkeley gets English troops to try to put down Bacon's rebellion, and those troops succeed, but not before Bacon burns Jamestown to the ground. He and the others are captured. Most of them are executed. And after 1675, the colony of Virginia turns away from indentured servants and increasingly to enslaved Africans. This is a turning point where previously a relatively large percentage of the workforce, more than half, were white indentured servants with a few African slaves. And there's an important and sharp distinction drawn between the positions of white people and the position of black people in much of the American South after Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon is a kind of capitulation to, or a giving up of authority to those white settlers. Bacon himself is defeated, but we see increasingly black slavery become the solution. Why? From the perspective of those large landholders, indentured servants were much cheaper. But as they saw it, Africans who were brought over from the New World are much more expensive, but they are there for life, and their children are there for life. And so we see a kind of similarity, a mix between indentured servants and enslaved people between the 1600s and 1675. We see a much more distinct color line drawn in Virginia after 1675. Does that make sense? Okay. New England is a very different kind of society, in part because it's a place that becomes a dumping ground for dissenters from the Anglican Church. Puritans, Pilgrims, and others. And these people mostly settle as families rather than as single men. And connected with the settlement, there's a great deal of proselytizing to native peoples further west, translating Bibles into native languages. Puritans believed that their duty was to assess the state of their own souls every day. As a result, they devoted themselves to self-examination and Bible study, and families prayed together under the guidance of a husband and father. This kind of settlement was much less chaotic and much less dangerous. In fact, for families or for people that settled in the old world, in the American South, death rates were very high and much higher than in England. After the first generation, death rates were low in New England, and children, families, got larger and larger and larger. 6, 7, something like 7.5 children on average for each family. This is partly a question of, what did Puritans believe their duty was? Puritans believed their duty was self-examination and study, to distinguish if you are godly, if you are in God's grace on a regular basis. In the Catholic Church, and even in the Anglican Church, the expectation was that your priest or parson would let you know where you stood, if you had gotten right with God or not. Puritans were much more focused on this as a problem, as a question. Am I godly enough? Will I get to heaven or not? They didn't face the kind of demographic imbalance that you saw in the South. Moreover, New England's climate was much healthier than that of the southern climates. So after the first 2 or 3 years, New England proved to be healthier than England. So a man in England, on average, if he got past the first 2 years, death rates for children were very, very high in England and in New England, but after the first 2 years, an English man could expect to live 50 to 55 years in England. If he emigrated to the Chesapeake or the South, he'd shave 10 years off his life, on average. If he settled in New England, he'd gain 10 years, so 60 and 65. These close-knit colonies had fewer chaotic problems, in part because children in these close-knit colonies were quickly farmed out to other families if someone died. Could I repeat what the Puritans did on John Eliot's slide? They did preach to native people, and they translated Bibles from English or from the Latin into into Indian languages. All right, bear with me here for a second. That's a good point. Well, am I going to highlight the contrasting points between my lectures? I am in on Wednesday and Friday. I'll do a better job of that. Today, I just want to sort of get through this distinction. But thank you. I'll try to return back to how I differ from Watson here. In fact, I'm pretty close to Watson, I think, when we're talking about the 17th century. There are conflicts in the New England, and in the same year, 1675, as Bacon's rebellion, there's something called King Philip's War that takes place in New England. It's difficult to underestimate how brutal this war is, primarily between Metacom, who you see here on the left, also called King Philip, and the English settlers on the other hand. The deaths were, the percentage deaths in King Philip's War were much, much higher than the later American Civil War or World War II. Native American deaths in King Philip's War were about 15% of the total population died in this war. This King Philip, initially a converted Indian, tries to push back against New England settlement. English deaths were about 1.5%, almost 2% of the entire population is wiped out. So this is what the settlement looks like for New England. In the English colonies in the South, you see a much more higgledy-piggledy kind of settlement where people claim land and make them what are called the metes and bounds themselves. So sort of draw these maps, and we'll talk a little about this a little bit when we talk about tobacco again. But New England settlements were much more orderly. This is why even today, if you go into New England, streets are organized in a kind of grid pattern. It's relatively easy to find your way around. In many parts of the South, but particularly in Virginia and North Carolina, you see a much more kind of chaotic settlement. King Philip was fighting against the New England colonists in this war, in the 1675 war. King Philip does die in the war. He's defeated. And after 1675, there are no major conflicts in New England with Indians, in part because so many of them have been wiped out. There will be continued conflict between Native people and Southern white settlers, Southern white and black settlers, over the next 100 years or so. Why so many children? Because children are the labor force that make New England possible. And so producing more children means having more labor in the fields. And this is somewhat different from the Southern pattern in which you see the majority of white settlers are the descendants of either orphans or orphanages or prisons with a tiny number of very elite families. And it's particularly on the coast, it's buying more people to work for you, enslaved people, African people. Because there was so much stability in New England by comparison, the New England courts famously were obsessed with moral crimes. The crimes that you see in Southern courts were murder, bastardy, that is children born out of wedlock, but rape, theft, destruction of property. What we see in New England is a relatively smaller moral crimes like responsibility for making someone's cow sick, or not reading the Bible, or not coming to church on Sunday. And this is where the witch trials are, and this is in large part because of that close collective kind of corporate sentiment in New England helps to produce a fairly serious disdain for people who are different from themselves. Yeah, the biggest crimes were in New England were fornication, that's sex with someone outside of marriage, adultery, sodomy, buggery, and public masturbation. By comparison, they're primarily property crimes that we see in the South, and violent crimes like murder. So, you would think that in a way, New England would be where the interesting and important events are taking place, but that's not true. New England is a good place for settlers, but it's a tiny place that grows, even as it grows naturally, relatively quickly. That is, families reproduce themselves fairly quickly. It's New England is literally small potatoes. You've heard that expression, small potatoes? That's literally what New England is producing, is small potatoes and basically food enough to feed themselves, very little to feed much of the rest of Europe. The New England colonists lacked a major staple commodity to export to England. Yet they needed to import countless things: tools, seed, livestock, clothing. Even when particular colonists in New England found opportunities to accumulate wealth, they would find themselves constrained by the association of profit with excess, which was considered a sin. Puritan villages, like the English villages they came from, were what was called moral economies, where they regulated prices, capped profits, and generally frowned on anyone who upset the stability of the community. By comparison, the American South, the area of the Carolina grants, will by the 1700s become the most important place in the world for exports. It becomes one of the wealthiest places. Crimes in England based more, sorry, I'm just reading these questions here. King Philip was against the Puritans. Were the crimes in England based more off disobeying the government than moral crimes? Crimes in New England were moral crimes in general. Crimes in the American South tended to be much more violent crimes, like murder or theft. So what kind of economy did New England have then? New England didn't have much of an economy. It had a kind of, particularly in the 1600s, it was almost cut off in many ways from the rest of the New World, even though it needed all these goods. Most important things in New England. Somebody asked, will you repeat the most important things in New England again? New England is the things that New England is importing. I guess that's the question. So what is New England importing? And that is tools, seeds, Finding my notes here. Oh, tools, seeds, livestock, and clothing. Those are the things that New England is importing and it needs. Oh, can I define buggery? No. You'll have to look it up. I'm on Twitch here. Yes, buggery is anal sex. So, okay. Out of the South, then, we get a turn away from the headright system and a large number of servants towards plantation societies with enslaved African people. And we'll talk a lot about the sort of enslaved African people that settled here. During the English Revolution in the 1650s, Southerners were more committed to the Royalists. They gained favors, they continued their royal governors, they drew closer to the Anglican Church, and they ignored the English Commonwealth, that is, Cromwell and his men. After the Restoration in 1660, Southern colonies continued the English Civil War. In fact, there were more kind of dissenting Protestants killed in the South after 1660 than in England after 1660. Once the Restoration happens, Virginians in particular go hunting for dissenting Protestants and wipe them out. In fact, Charles II sends a note to Virginia saying, you need to stop. The people who supported Charles I are gone. We've executed them all. For planters and English merchants, Southern colonies are consistently aggressive in pushing Indians back. For planters and the English merchants who furnished them with supplies, the Chesapeake became the real money-making operation in the 1600s. Northern colonies were much less valuable to England. Many refugees were attracted to the Commonwealth, a sense of godliness and also a sense of self-righteousness. By 1675, two communities, though, shared one thing, and that was a common distrust of Indians to the west. In Aztec, Maya, and Inca societies in Mexico and Brazil, we see a large Creole population emerge with people of mixed ancestry, mixed African, European, and Central and South American ancestry. There's much less of that in the Americas, in the northern part of the Americas, in part because the native societies of North America are more mobile, they resist enslavement, they escape. Aztec, Maya, and Inca societies had been more hierarchical and fixed in place, and those people were more integrated in a sort of syncretic way into that society. But what becomes Anglo-American society is mostly about pushing back against those people. The Anglican Cavaliers escaped to the south, they moved to the south, where they would party and pay for enslaved people to do their work. They would buy brides from England when they could afford to buy them. And so there was a kind of a regular shipment of women who would be sent over from England to be bid on as wives in the 1600s. The Creole population, Creole just means mixed, and so the Creole population is a mixture of African, Latin American, and European society. We don't see much Creolization in North America, in English North America. In 1675, there was a common distrust of who? The common distrust of Native Americans to the west. The Puritan Roundheads escaped to the north as men and women, as families. They tried to create a Puritan society where they could practice their religion freely and prevent anyone else from practicing their religion. Splinters from the Puritan society go off to Boston, to Rhode Island, and they would found very different societies. They do try to proselytize to Indians and convert them, and when that failed in 1675 with King Philip's War, their response to the burning and destruction is close to wholesale slaughter. So there's no syncretism, or not the same kind of syncretism as we see in Latin America. Some intermingling of traditions about food, about planting, about settlement. Many of the things that we do in our kind of daily lives, barbecues and how we grow crops and how we harvest them, how we eat, are kind of American traditions that are hundreds, even thousands of years old, often invisible to us. By around the 1670s, the success of English sugar plantations and English tobacco plantations would lead to a huge amount of money coming to the New World. And particularly the American South. The wealth of the Caribbean would ultimately be the key to solving the problems of New England and the problems of the American South. We'll talk about how New England goes from being a place that's on the edge of British society to slowly scooching itself into the middle of this trade. On Wednesday and Friday. And I will, I promise, talk a little bit more about where I differ from Harry Watson. Harry Watson and I primarily disagree about the 19th century, but the 17th and 18th century, there's room for disagreement as well. Okay, thanks so much.